Thank you, Sergio. Welcome, everybody. Good morning. Happy Wednesday. It's Wednesday, right? Had a rough night getting here, but here we are, and it's a beautiful day. And so we're going to start off the week with talking to two guys about the future, kind of the whole future of technology for cycling, not just mountain biking, not just e-bikes, not just road bikes. For anyone who doesn't know, I'm Zapata Espinoza. I've been a journalist in the industry for decades. Since 1986, I got started in Mountain Bike Action, went through a few different magazines. I worked at Trek as a brand manager for a few years in Wisconsin. Been to the races, done gravel bikes, road bikes, mountain bikes, everything about bicycles, and a whole lot of motorcycles too, but that's a whole other world. So anyways, today we really fortunate to have two super smart guys in terms of future visionaries, I think, and technologists about where the bike industry has been, which is super important. We were just talking about this before in terms of as much as we think about the future, it's really important that we think about the past and where the bike industry has gone and where bicycle technology has been as a precursor to as much as we can think about where it's going. To my left is Steve Domahidy, really highly regarded in terms of me personally. I've been following his bike stuff. He's been doing some incredible bikes he's designed over the years for Factor, his own mountain bike now, which everybody should make sure they look closely at in the back of the room. But a whole bunch of different bikes and some of the most dynamic bikes. And again, as me as a journalist, always trying to search out the most dynamic bikes. He's one guy I've always been able to go to, just been infatuated with. His base of knowledge is just amazing. And then Erick down at the end is new to me, but as I was discussing his career, it's amazing what he set up in Canada in terms of, again, being a design consultant and basis of foundation for designing of bikes. And now he's got a successful company designing bikes and, I mean, all kinds of information or providing support for bike industry people, again, going to the future in terms of what it's going to look like. So a couple of really big visionaries here that I'm as interested to hear and talk about where the sport's headed, industry's headed, as I hope all you are. But first, they're both going to give themselves their own little bit of background. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Zap. Appreciate it, Zap. If you guys don't know or haven't followed Zap before, he actually just had a podcast with Dave Zimmeroff of SRAM doing that. What is the name of that podcast again? Changing Gears. Anyway, you should check it out. This guy's a legend. Just did a really cool thing with Johnny T in Colorado on the Johnny T ranch, discussing an old bike down there. He's an John Tomac. Oh, John Tomac. Yes. Okay. If anybody, there are a few people here that may not know who John Tomac is, but he was the best mountain biker in the world for a number of years. Anyway, my name's Steve Domahidy. I'm probably most known for co-founding Niner Bikes. I designed all of their bikes for the first 7 years of Niner's existence and hold all the patents that the IP filing were under my name as the inventor of those things, so CVA suspension and some of the other things that Niner has done over the years. I helped launch Factor Bikes, which is a Tour de France team at this point, or sponsoring a Tour de France team at this point. And among others, Faraday was an electric bike brand that was purchased by Pon. So I've kind of touched a lot of different aspects of the bike industry: gravel, road, electric bikes, city bikes, mountain bikes, and so kind of have a pretty big arch of experience in the bike industry.
Thank you, Steve. So my name is Erick Auger. You can pronounce it Auger. I'm fine with it. I've been in bike industry for all my life, basically. So started as a young kid racing bikes. Soon got into bike shops where I've worked for 6 years. And this is where my brain juice started flowing. And at that time, bikes weren't really reliable. So I said, I need to fix that. So I went to mechanical engineering school, graduated in '94. And ended up up north in Quebec province in Canada to work for a company called Cycles Da Vinci, which was really small at that time. We were producing like a few hundred bikes. I've stayed with that company for 13 years where I was head of R&D. became minority shareholder, so that got me into the business side of the company. And I was involved in all the aspects from sourcing, manufacturing, because it was one of the only companies still manufacturing bikes in North America. And yeah, so it was a really good learning ground for these 13 years. Afterwards, I went to consulting company, general consulting, like in designing products, where I learned the service aspect of it. And in 2010, got an inception on building like a consulting company, combining design and engineering, because a bicycle needs to achieve both on the same structure, which is quite difficult. And here we go, like it's been 14 years almost, and we're now up to 33 employees, mechanical engineers, industrial designers, and we are working in the shadows of bike brands, and we're building their like product line. We do all kinds of bicycle. If it's called bicycle, we are involved. So went as far as building some bikes for downhill racers, the Olympic project track bike for the Tokyo Olympic for the Japanese Federation. And the rest is like different products from mountain bikes, gravel bike, and everything you can think of. And e-bikes have been a really big part of our business for the last few years. Last year, I think it was over 70% of the project we did were e-bikes. So here I am. Thank you.
Good, good. Okay, so again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, I think that first and foremost, I'm super biased for bicycles and a complete partisan and elitist and everything about bicycles, right? So I can, if I come off sounding somewhat like, you know, diminishing other things, which I'm about to do, I apologize. But so for the 40 years that I've been doing bicycles, you know, it seems like every year we're kind of like, you know, gosh, what more can happen with bicycles? And I think the thing that's so amazing about bicycles to me is that for the 40-year span that I've been doing this, every year, every month, every day just about, there arrives some new notion about what a bicycle could be. And that's one thing I think makes bicycle, the industry, so amazing, because as opposed to someone who's in the folding chair business, I don't know how much innovation's going into folding chairs, right? Maybe not much, maybe a whole lot, I just don't know. But I'm just looking at the, you know, folding chairs and like thinking about it. And the bicycle, again, like Steve's bicycle back there, the bikes that you guys have talked about, like the downhill bikes I've been looking at just at the World Cups the last few months. It's just staggering to me that as much as people think, oh, it's just a bicycle, or what more we could possibly do to make a bicycle different or even better, lo and behold, with each successive year, each successive season, those changes come along. So I guess just to start off, since we talked about this earlier, you guys, I was hoping maybe each of you could think of, if you could think of like one aspect of the past, and we don't need to go back to the Wright brothers and their bicycle shop necessarily, but there's been a lot of innovation since then. But just again, we have collective about the same period of time we've been in the bike industry. What's kind of one tip for each of you, one notion about what has happened in the past that we've gotten away from in terms of where we're going now, in terms of how we're introducing and coming up with and developing new technology? I don't know if that's specific enough, but again, just what we were talking about before, I was just thinking about that. You know, before we were saying like how, you know, 35 years ago, every bike was a hardtail, and the only way you could distinguish one bike from another was, well, what's the rear derailleur? Oh, that's got an XT derailleur. Oh, that's at a certain price point. Now that's at, you know, XTR or something. And now, of course, the volume of decisions that a consumer has to make in terms of what bicycle they should have or could have, it just seems to me it's like overwhelming. But again, before we dive into the future, which I think with you two guys especially will take us so deep into this conversation, is there anything in the past that again you could draw on that in terms of like?
Well, I think it's really interesting. The bike industry has gone through a pretty large transformation. In the 90s, you know, everybody was just literally like throwing stuff on the wall and building it and letting consumers sort of test it. And this is not unique to like smaller brands just trying to figure it out. This is like Trek. Trek's first full suspension bike was
Horrible.
horrible. It was really one of the worst bikes ever built, and it literally had a donut, an elastomer donut was their suspension, and that was in a single swing arm, and it was a high pivot, and nobody even understood that like you needed an idler pulley for a high pivot. It was like completely no understanding of what the suspension was going to do to a drivetrain, and they would just put it out there and like literally sell it to consumers. Be like, yeah, try it out, it's great, and they would tell you why it was great, and nobody really knew why it was great, or if it was great, or even how it was great. They just kind of like assumed like, oh, we put a pivot there and it's great, like. And then consumers wrote them and said, nah, it's not really that great. And then they went back to the drawing board, and the next year they'd come out with something totally different, and that would be great too. And and it was a crazy like hodgepodge of technology that sort of shaped the industry for the 90s that is not how bikes are made today. It's really much more methodical and much more scientific, and people are strapping like, they're strapping things onto their bikes, like data centers onto their bikes to get data, to collect data and evaluate in the computer. And it's really a much different experience in the world of bikes today.
Just real quick, because it's interesting, because personally, back in like 1991, when Trek developed that bike, I almost lost my job over it when I wrote the review of it, and the guys at Trek called up, and it was just this, it was bad. But I remember I have a special place in my heart for that bike because it almost cost me my job. And it was like when we were editors back there, it's like the one word, because again, that's a great point about back when this is early suspension, people were just throwing mud on walls, eh? And luckily, the motorcycle guys, Mert Lawwell and the likes, they came in with motorcycle, an understanding, Horst Leitner, an understanding of how suspension could work and should work, and really educated the bicycle guys who knew nothing about suspension, damping, or anything. But the Trek was a horrible bike. I remember I referred to it as a bucking bronco, and that you should have your chaps. If you're going to ride the bike, you should bring your chaps with you because it rode like, it was, and my point was, we would hardly ever use the D word. We always said, don't ever say anything's dangerous, right? That bike was dangerous. And yet, when you said that, in terms of how we've gone away from that, I'm just thinking about now, because even now, you can go to on Pink Bike, and I always go there to just after a World Cup downhill race, especially, just to see all the different bikes. And I'm still, this is what I was referring to earlier, staggered at this today, all the different design ideas that people are coming up for downhill bikes. All the bikes with the idler pulleys, high, low. It still seems like, again, we've come so far, admittedly, but it still seems like, and which speaks to the creative mind, I think, of just what people still think, no, we're still not there yet, because it's still not just a single pivot or a horse link or anything else. The designs of the downhill bikes to me, they're mind-blowing, right? So, what do you see in terms of with your clients trying to define what that vision is going to be for the future?
Like, it's a fine balance because we need to gain market acceptance. So sometimes we have the idea to do a leapfrog in forward technology, but the market wouldn't be ready. So that's why with mountain bikes, it took a lot of years to get to where we are. But we're finally at the point where we basically have like motocross, like suspension on our bikes. But at first, like, these solutions were too heavy, too bulky, and so we relied on elastomers to do this kind of job and trying to make it as simple as possible. But there's limitation to that. So we've evolved like slowly to the process of having like bikes that are heavier than the one we rode in the 90s, but that weight was put to good use in performance. So, when you think about it, like clipless pedal, suspension, front and rear, disc brake, it all came with a weight penalty, but brought huge performance benefit. And to me, it's always been like which type of terrain you can go with a bicycle that impressed me the most. Like fat bike is an example. Up in Canada, we have a lot of snow. So finally, there's a bike that can go and ride on snow. So right now I'm doing like bike 365 days a year, which is good. So solving these kind of problems and seeing what people can do on bicycle these days is completely amazing to me.
Is there, oh, go ahead.
That's a really good point, though. I just wanted to tackle onto that point, Eric, and actually you mentioned it too. The motorcycle industry is a major driver of the mountain bike industry in ways that we don't even really understand. I think a lot of what Eric was just alluding to there is that there are technologies that exist. There are technologies that we can go to and that we can create tomorrow. We have the technology for them that consumers simply will not accept. And I think one of the best examples of this, going back into history, is Girvan's linkage fork. Girvan's linkage fork on the K2 bikes that were out in the mid-90s was actually one of the best ways to suspend the front wheel. And consumers simply said, no, it does not look like a suspension fork. It doesn't look like my motorcycle suspension fork. I don't want it. Motorcycle forks have sliders, and that's what I'm used to, and that's what I should be sold, and that's what a mountain bike should look like, and that's all I'm going to accept. It didn't matter that the linkage fork would have less stiction. The linkage fork could, if designed properly, have less dive under braking, and you could control a lot of different variables that aren't controllable in a standard telescoping fork. But consumers just won't accept it because it doesn't look like what their brains tell them a mountain bike should look like.
And that's really key. I mean, I've so many times the discussions with bike company people, or in the years I'd be visiting companies and they'd be showing stuff, on the wall, blueprint of something, and there is that's a really important part too, in terms of what, especially when it comes to the engineers saying, no, this is it, and you're like, no, you don't understand. Nobody is going to buy that thing, right? Because there's this internal conflict with companies in terms of what a bike could be, should be, in terms of how it rides and ride quality, and just how far the consumers are willing to go to accept it. And we've seen, countless bikes and technologies that have just kind of failed, that maybe were brilliant, that, I mean, even we've gone even so far away from, grip shift, which was, originally this great thing, and now, of course, triggers are everywhere, and of course, now it's just buttons, right? But what about not to be the same thing we're talking about? We're like in terms of full suspension with mountain bikes. We were talking about earlier, but again, how ubiquitous carbon fiber itself has been. And you guys were making these great ideas or great points back there that in terms of like how at this day where carbon fiber seems as common as gravity, right, on any given day, that now the bike industry or bike industry thinkers, designers are just starting to think getting away from carbon fiber, which seems like, to me, like that's going to be impossible. I mean, I hope it's true to some degree. First of all, I mean, titanium to me is still a great frame material, as for a frame specifically. But maybe, what do each of you think about just again that notion? Is there room to get away from carbon fiber? And again, we talked about e-bikes, mountain bikes, all these different categories of bikes, but maybe in the most general sense of understanding the manufacturing process that's involved in.
Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah. I think carbon fiber brought something to the table from the fact that you have no limitation in shapes you can achieve with it. And this was the driver of making modern aluminum bicycles that are using hydroforming, complex forging to look like their carbon counterpart, which was really good. So that has made an evolution. Carbon, although it's a great material, it comes with like a lot of like problems that are hidden from the end user, and the end user maybe don't want to hear about it. But the reject rate in the factory is quite high, like 25-ish and up. So I've seen factories where they pile up the rejects on the roof, and it's mountain of frames that are up to the ceiling here. So that's kind of like bad, and in a way, and it's really labor intensive, like a company that produces like 200,000 bicycle frames a year would employ maybe 3,000 employees, and it's all labor, and a lot of things can go wrong in the process. So there's new technology that are coming that are more automated, that will be able to reduce that waste, will be also able to increase recyclability of the material, which right now it's not. So we will see an emergence of what we call thermoplastic. So it's a different family of composites. So the composites right now are thermosets. So the resin is called like the epoxy. That's the most common. And the automotive industry is doing a big push towards thermoplastic because it's a fast cycle of curing, like 5 minutes instead of 45 minutes, which will at some point bleed out to the bicycle industry. So there's a few players who are tackling with thermoplastic right now, but I think in the future we will see more of that. And alloy, I think, is making a comeback from the fact that people are no longer seeking weight as their main target for purchasing a bicycle. They know the benefit of having something that performs well, and they are ready to do the trade-off. And it's even more true with e-bikes, where the battery and the motor itself represent the bigger portion of the weight of the bicycle. So by having carbon fiber or alloy doesn't make such a big difference on the total weight of an e-bike.
Yeah, there's a lot of push. There's a big push. As Eric said, thermoplastics are a big push. I think the industry is trying to wrestle with being a little bit more ecological, and I don't know that we've come to grips exactly with what that means. I think a lot of people use it as a buzzword, and a lot of people are trying to sort of introduce the green nature of their bikes. Trek is actually doing a really great job trying to reduce packaging and trying to do some things that are actually making it an effort to impact global environmentalism. But you know, as we kind of continue to progress, I think the technologies will be there that we can do these technologies in a way that actually does have a benefit and sell that as part of the process. And thermoplastics are a benefit, one, in that they don't have to be stored at freezing. So one of the big problems with carbon fiber, pre-preg carbon fibers are all required to be stored in a freezer at freezing temperature. They have they're pre-impregnated with the resin that cures the carbon fiber, and so in order to store those things, you have to store them in a freezer, and that's pretty big. If you've ever been to Envy and walked through their manufacturing facility, they have freezers that are they have 2 freezers that are roughly the size of this room. So you can imagine what kind of impact that makes on carbon footprint, right? Like that's a lot of energy to have to store and keep that at a frozen temperature. So that's one of the things that thermoplastics get away from. They can be stored at room temperature. They don't have to be in a freezer, and they can cure in an oven much faster. So that also saves in carbon footprints. So we are working towards these new technologies, but I don't think that we've tackled them. I think companies are trying to get green and use green buzzwords because it's the cool thing to do, and I think we're slowly transitioning into actually doing the right things for the right reasons, and it's taken a little bit longer to trickle down to the bike industry. Notoriously, the bike industry really is a product of technologies trickling down from other industries, especially in terms of carbon fiber or these technologies. We don't invent them for the bike industry. We borrow them from other aerospace industry or automotive industry, and we kind of right now are in this holding pattern where we have to wait for that technology to become either affordable or doable, or like somebody else like at Boeing has invented this technology and suddenly 5 years in we can use it because it's no longer under protected patent or whatever it is. So we have kind of like sat on our heels in a lot of ways and just sort of waited for technology to come to us that we can use and call green or call greener.
Both those topics can bring to mind the inevitable, which, the elephant in the room, e-bikes. And again, we were talking about that earlier, but what about that idea? I mean, because even with cars now, obviously so much is happening with everything, right? And still, as much as E is driving this discussion about greener and better for the environment in terms of gas and everything, we're still hearing, kind of biting criticisms of, man, where's all that lithium coming from, and the mines here, and yada, yada, yada. And then big thing in the bike industry is like who's really, again, I think Specialized has done some good work with this in terms of regenerating batteries and stuff like that, in terms of recycling batteries. I've seen a little bit about, but that's like a big thing, especially with all those janky e-bikes that came, in the last couple of years during COVID, where, I mean, just like, I know the bike shops I like, they don't even want to work on them. They have no idea where they came from, anything. So you're just like thinking about these, again, massive graveyards of e-bikes, but more specifically, batteries and motors. Is there any kind of like, again, using the level of foresight you guys have in terms of kind of to help put that off to some, is there some avenue we can start thinking about that could, because e-bikes are here, e-bikes are happening, they're only going to keep getting bigger.
Yeah.
And yet they, as opposed to just a carbon fiber frame, they also bring this extra added element of a battery and a motor that somehow, in terms of, what we should all be thinking as like-minded cyclists, some level of like environmentalism is why we're doing what we're doing. At least it is for me. What about that with e-bikes and?
I still think it's a trickle down. I still think the bike industry is suffering from this trickle down technology. I mean, there's definitely movement in the space of motors and batteries to become a little bit less dependent on rare earth metals. There's a lot of technology going into electric motors that are don't have magnets in them, and that's going to be able to remove the rare earth elements from the magnets that are in a lot of batteries. So nibidium or whatever that element is that they put in magnets. So there is technology there that's going into electric motors, but it's not electric motors for mountain bikes or road bikes or even bikes in general. Those are electric motors that people are working on for cars, and that's going to have to trickle down. At the end of the day, price is still such a driver of e-bikes, and a lot of the e-bikes that you're talking about that are in the industry here that are hazards to landfill and other things are those like $1,000, $1,500 e-bikes that are coming directly from China, where there are no controls and no real oversight into how those got made or how they even got to the United States. In a lot of cases, people don't even know that. Like, where did I buy this bike from? So that, people a lot of times complain about the price of bikes in the U.S. and the skyrocketing price. I mean, Santa Cruz just came out with their brand new e-bike, the Bronson SL, and the top of the line model is $13,000. I think it's $12,900 or something like that. And people are like, you could buy a Yamaha for that much, and they kind of freak out about the price. But nobody in the bike industry is making a fortune. We're not working on margins. Like, nobody's ripping off the consumer here. Like the price is kind of driven by all of the amount of technology that is in that product. And at the end of the day, it's a lot of technology in a small amount of units. Yamaha can make 5 million motorcycles, and that can drive prices really low, and their margins can be a lot smaller because they're making 5 million of them. But Santa Cruz is only going to sell 5,000 maybe of that Bronson SL. I mean, it's just at that $13,000 level. It's not as much as you think. It's not as many bikes as you might think.
And when we're doing this analogy with motorcycles, usually the material that are being used, the surface finish, the strength to weight ratio is nowhere near the bicycle. Bicycle has the limitation of the motor, which is the cyclist. So we need to, in order to get proper performance, we need to lighten the bike as much as possible. And this pushes us towards material that costs more, that you need to heat treat, a lot of process. And of course, sometimes the surface finish on these products are quite amazing. Bikes are usually work of art, in my sense. I have my ex-business partner was an industrial designer, came from Bombardier, BRP, making snowmobiles, like Spider, like 3-wheel vehicles. And every time on his mood board, he would have bicycle parts and say, we need to make our product as nice as these bicycle parts, like an XTR crank, for instance. But it never made it to the end. It was cut due to pricing related. So we need to be careful with the analogy, of course, it's true that like these products seems to be complex. They have combustion engine with like thousands of parts, and yet like they sell it for like much less. E-bikes are also much more complex than electric motorcycle, from the fact that the only input a motorcycle has is a throttle, like at your finger. A bicycle is assisted electrically, which needs to do a mix of the power input of the person and the power input of the motor. So algorithms, all types of sensor that needs to sense what the cyclist is doing in order to provide the best level of assistance. So a electric bicycle, even at its lowest form, will always cost more than an electric motorcycle.
This is a corollary to the e-bikes in terms of, wasn't a critique, but Erick, what you had said earlier too, I thought was really spot on in terms of where the bike industry is right now, just on e-bike specific. That notion about, we were talking about, what, like again, the hardtails would just slap a derailleur on any bike to make it differentiate. And could you just, again, kind of go over that, what you were talking about, how it just like the bike industry is just like we're being, not victimized, but like the motor is like, we're building around the motor, like, or, how you talk about just the frame is just a frame. And
yeah, it's true. Like these days, bikes are no longer this compatible structure that can accept parts from different suppliers. Now we're designing bicycle around a motor system coming from one company, and these company do not even have consistency in the form factor of the motor and the battery and the mounting points. So even if you're going with Bosch, you end up making a bike specifically for Bosch and specifically for a model of motor that Bosch is providing you. We had, like, I won't complain, but one thing that it has kept us really busy over the last year was redesigning products for discontinued motors that never went to market. There was like motor that Shimano or Bosch were kind of going forward, and at the last minute, these projects were canned or canceled, and then our client had no choice of redesigning the whole bike. So we are at the point where bicycle brands do not have like a full ownership of the bicycle, and that might be a problem for the future where we're relying on these companies, and the end user will make his buying decision based on the motor you have. So it will discard every bicycle that do not have this motor. It's a big task of getting there for the bike industry, but the bike industry needs to get more involved, even if they are not fully designing the e-bike motor, the batteries. They need to get involved. They need to understand the technology behind it in order to be a player and not being pushed away in the near future.
Yeah, we're in a weird space right now where we still have Specialized and Giant and Trek, right? And they obviously their buying power drives a lot of technology and a lot of innovation, but they're still at the mercy of the motor company, of Shimano, of the newcomers on the SL market are TQ and Fazua. Fazua is owned, by the way, mostly by Porsche. So Porsche is buying into mobility and has purchased a majority share of an electric motor that is a bicycle motor. And so that's a really interesting, the car industry is also an interesting analogy, the car and the motorcycle industry, because you go and buy a Yamaha, and a Yamaha is a Yamaha, right? You think you're buying a Yamaha, or you think you're buying a Ford. And what you don't realize is Ford has sub-consultants or vendors that are making their tachometers or their instrument panel or their, Ford is not designing their own, touch panel displays, right? They're just buying those from another company. So they're sourcing parts just like Specialized would be sourcing parts for their bikes. But you really, when you go to a Ford dealership, you just buy a Ford, and largely it's invisible about who Ford is working with or who their subcontractors are. And I think that that's actually one of the things that is both interesting in the bike industry in that we're not doing that. We're still branding frames and then bolting on motors and then bolting on drivetrains. But we're sort of moving that direction. You know, the industry is sort of trying to get more and more individualized or integrated, you know, and integration is one of the coolest parts of the bike industry, but it's also one of the most dangerous in that it could leave smaller players behind. So it's something that we have to tackle and kind of figure out.
So that was, you gonna say something?
Yeah, and just to do to your point, I was listening to a podcast with Ford's CEO, and he was telling how late they are to the electric car game, and they didn't realize it until they have produced their first cars. And the problem comes from these vendors, which all have their own technology, own programming behind it, and their own IP. So if they want to make change, they need to talk to at least 150 different software and electronic companies. So just pushing like an idea over the air update, they cannot do it. And this is where Tesla was so successful, where they realized that they were so successful is like designing electronics part and the software program that goes with it. So, and they need to go back to the drawing board for their second generation.
Right. So Steve, just listening to you just now, you brought up two notions that I think are interesting, and one was integration, talk about, but also you just were sort of hinting on kind of big guy versus little guy. And we're lucky we have Rick Vosper in the audience today, and he'll be a speaker later this week. And Rick, who's one of the best critical minds about the bike industry itself for being a veteran of it. And just recently, we were talking earlier about the column he just wrote about the quadrumvirate. How do you say it? Quadrumvirate. Yeah, of the big guys, eh? The Trek, Specialized, Pond, and Giant. And so what I was thinking about in terms of, you know, his discussion was more on the retail basis with the dealers, which is really, again, as much as we talked about all the cycle of influence in the future, bike shops, you know, are the most vaunted and most important, to me, most important part of of the bike industry. That's a whole other discussion, which I'm sure Rick's going to touch on. But what about that, though, in terms of, you know, we have these four bigger bike brands, bigger bike groups, perhaps, in terms of how much they're able to drive and direct the orientation of the technology that ends up that the smaller guys have to sort of play, or not, I don't want to say victim to, that's the wrong word. But
yeah, there's a little give and take there. It's a really interesting dichotomy in the bike industry. When we first founded Niner, everybody in the industry, I had worked for SRAM, I'd been in the industry at that point for 15 years. I had done a lot of things, and Chris and I sat down in 2004 and launched Niner at the Interbike Expo in Vegas. It was still in Vegas at the time. And we literally just came up with the business plan like at a restaurant in Vegas, like at lunch. And everybody...
That's all it takes. A good lunch in Vegas.
A good lunch in Vegas and a company is born. You know, people in the industry thought we were crazy to do a 29-inch wheel only company. Everybody that I talked to was like, are you nuts, Steve? What are you doing? Like, just don't. That's just not going to work, and nobody cares. And, you know, Chris and I were like, nope, this is what we're doing, and we see the future. And we definitely weren't, you know, Niner was not the first company to invent the 29-inch wheel, but not by any stretch of the imagination. Mid-90s, you know, I rode a Diamondback, was it a Diamondback? That was a 700C bike with smoke tires on it, 700 by 45 smokes, front and rear. And I was like, this thing is amazing. I was in Houston, Texas at the time, and it rode over everything, and it was absolutely amazing. So Niner was not the first to make the 29-inch wheel. I would argue that Niner was the first to do it right, and I would also argue that it drove the big ones to change their business strategy. So that's a case of where the small guys kind of got ahead of the curve, saw what was happening, saw what could be done, and the big guys had to follow. And they followed very begrudgingly. Specialized, actually, there was a race team that they sponsored in Southern California that we also sponsored as Niner, which was weird. They were co-sponsored by Niner and Specialized, but that's because the racers wanted to race 29-inch wheels and Specialized wouldn't make them, and so they're like, we're just gonna use Niners then until you guys make a 29-inch wheel. And really curmudgeoningly, they were like, okay. So I think that's a case where, there's still a lot of opportunity for the small guys to discover things that can really be game-changing technology. But when it comes to things that cost a lot of money, like motor technology or battery technology, they are the ones that are gonna kind of have to it's gonna be a balancing act, right? Like it'll be a small guy that can still come up with some new inventive thing that, is a suspension design that hasn't been seen before that people really latch on to. But, at the same time, it's going to be really difficult for a small guy to make a huge leap in motor technology without some massive amount of influx of capital. It's always a capital-based thing.
Right. But especially when it comes to e-bike, back to Erick's point, again, there's you see the ads for these Taiwan frame companies. They're just like this aluminum frame with a bolting mount, and it's just like, pick your frame, pick your color, call it what you get your own graphics kit, and you're just going to slap this motor. It's A-Pro, right, or something, a Taiwan frame shop, and they just have all these carcasses, or when I was at Eurobike, again, a wall of these aluminum carcasses, that just slap and go, and it just seemed like, okay, it's like going to 31 flavors, and you see the cone, and you just get to pick. I'll pick that one and that one, and that one goes on that cone. So there it is, and again, for just to take away the romantic notion of what the bicycle could be and should be and has been, we still have, get teary-eyed thinking this, the romantic notions of, Ernesto Colnago, as I've seen him literally panning these, he showed me one time the blueprints of the different bicycles that he had, his hand drawings of himself, very very different designs, and it was just like, oh, that's beautiful, and now it's just plug and play. So an issue?
Yeah, I don't think so. And I see smaller brands be more innovative than the bigger companies. The bigger companies often take the merit because they have a much wider, bigger bandwidth. So they are able to learn about industry inside of the products that are being developed by smaller companies, and they beat them to the market with their own idea. But the real innovation is coming from smaller brands because they are driven, they are passionate, they are willing to take risk, which big companies are not able to take risk on colors, on part specs, and so on. So I feel that there's a synergy where the big companies need the smaller innovative companies in order to exist.
Here.
Yeah. We currently have Boost 148 because of Trek.
Yeah.
Trek was the one who designed it. People were really irritated. 142 was fine. We didn't need 148. Why did you widen it 6 millimeters? Who cares? But that is the standard that we have today, and we have that because of Trek. Now, some of the things that some of the smaller companies are doing are, a lot of that, actually even the high pivot stuff that's happening in a lot of cases is being driven by smaller, manufacturers. The DH scene is filled with them. There's a company in Europe right now, Gamix Racing, who's got a high pivot gearbox bike that they're racing on the downhill circuit, and that's none of the big players are messing around with that. And actually, I was just in Portland at MADE and spent about a half an hour talking about how I think the pinion gearbox, or the gearbox in general, should be changing the mountain bike industry. And at the end of the conversation, the guy was like, oh, by the way, I'm with Specialized, and just was, I'm one of the engineers, and just wanted to know why you liked the gearbox. And these little spies coming out into small shows like MADE just to pick up what the little guys are doing and how they are innovating and how they should be thinking about things outside of their little box of major corporation.
Yeah, that's a great point. I was, as a big fan favorite of all the small guys back in the early mountain bike days. Whether it was Yeti and all, just there's hundreds of small guys, Barracudas, and they were but I remember being at NABS, the North American Handmade Bike Show, once in Sacramento, and handmade bikes, and you just see these rows like this, like, you know, an army of Trek guys and Specialized guys, you know, and like no lanyards, right? They're just kind of trying to be like, you know, no logos, and yet they're just sitting there like, you know, everything, you know. And I just like, you know, I was like thinking, okay, the little guy is still there. I mean, just even the way someone would draw a cable guide on a bike or something. I mean, so it's not to take away the small guy, you know, the value and the uniqueness that's still there with the small guy, just in terms of thinking of seeing, again, especially with the e-bike, in terms of how it just seems like, again, the carcass of a frame, it seems like there's there's less room maybe for the small guys to innovate when so much of it is sort of has to be preconditioned with that motor. But, and then what about in terms of, if you guys, and we've kind of all over the place here, but, you know, as much as we say, again, I started off saying how there was like each consecutive year, it's like, oh, there's nothing more that's going to happen now. Is there any particular one or two things that each of you can think about where you're thinking we haven't even gotten there yet, or there's still, you know, is there more to come element?
Yeah, gosh. Yeah, I mean, the e-bike world is we're just scratching the surface, I think. Again, we're a little bit at the disposal of like battery, you know, technology trickling down. Again, we're sort of a product of the trickle down technology that we get as Tesla like pushes the boundaries of what a battery can do. We can sort of get that into our bike technology pipeline, so to speak. But I mean, when you think about it right now, there's really no reason on an e-bike especially that the pedals have to be connected to the rear wheel. I mean, it would be a weight penalty to put a motor on the back or to somehow disconnect that, but the technology exists right now, especially for commuter bikes, that a chain and even a connection between the front crank arm and the rear wheel doesn't need to be there. There are e-bikes out there that exist that do not have a drivetrain. They literally have a motor and a battery system where the cranks are, and a motor in the back that inputs the crank sensors into forward motion of the rear wheel. Yeah, just like disconnected. What is the chain for? What is a driveline for? What do you need that for? So I guess, you know, pedal by wire, you would call it. I don't know.
Yeah.
But that technology exists. We have it. We have the capability of doing it. So there are tons and tons of ways in which the e-bike hasn't even touched the surface. There's so much. The suspension itself has so much kinetic energy just in suspending a rider. So if you think about a full suspension bike and the rear wheel moving and all those pivots, you know, typically 4, sometimes 6, sometimes 8 now. I don't know. There's in God number of moving pivots that have kinetic energy stored and are ways that we could actually use to dampen the bike. You can use electronic. You can use magnetic damping, especially when weight doesn't matter. You can use that. You can restore energy into the battery through suspension components. I mean, SRAM is patenting the pulley wheel as being a force of regeneration for electricity. So there's a lot of patent filings. I guess our other guy could have spoken a little bit more to this, but there's a lot of patent filings around that kind of energy that is being not wasted but evaporated into the ethersphere that we could be utilizing in bike design. So there's a lot we can do.
Definitely. And we see Alan Cote is not here today with us, but we do like IAP, like patent watch at our office to get inspired and to see potential roadblocks in the future. And we're just starting to touch into the electronic parts of the bicycle, which I think will be great. Of course, it's bringing like another layer of cost and complexity, but it has the advantage of making your product better over time with updates, better algorithms to assist you, like for the motor assistance, the way it can predict what you're doing in certain types of conditions, and just ways you can interact with the bicycle. There's a lot of things, and how the components will start talking to each other, and so the bike could understand what you actually want to do with this. So, like an idea that we had forever, for instance, with a commuter bike would be to use a principle similar to a dropper post, but that would be something that would adjust its height based on the speed you're going at. So near a red light or a stop sign would lower automatically, and your foot could be standing flat on the ground and reaccelerating, going up back to the saddle height. So a lot of these things will come. Like there was a patent from SRAM lately, like now that they have the ecosystem of electronic shifters, like they are filing a lot of patents on how do you shift. So like having sensors in your gloves where you can touch your fingers and making a shift happen, or tapping on your grip and add a sensor that would activate your dropper post, shift your bike. So wild ideas, but they might lead to something in the future.
Yeah, we easily have the technology right now where we could be wearing sunglasses with a heads-up display that shows us what gear we're in, and we could just say 4, and our bike would shift for us. As long as we weren't giving somebody our telephone number, that would be fine. But there is stuff out there, and again, I think a lot of the technology that comes to the bike industry is really predicated on whether or not the consumer will accept it. I mean, I don't think that consumers are ready to see mountain bikes with no chain and no drivetrain actually attached to it. I mean, I think that would be a really difficult thing to wrap people's heads around. But integration is definitely something that needs to happen a little bit better than it is right now. One of the problems we have is because Porsche owns Fazua, right, and then people want that motor, but that motor doesn't really talk to Shimano components or SRAM components. So there's all these separate, disparate items that people are still bolting onto the bike, and there's not really a good cohesion with all of that system yet. And that's something that really we need to start working on. SRAM has a connection piece to their rear derailleur where you can basically plug it into the battery of an e-bike, so that you don't have to have a battery on your AXS derailleur. They have that in their catalog, but I've not seen it used on a single bike in a bike store ever. So basically, you get an e-bike and you have the battery, the huge battery that you have to keep charged, and then you have a battery in a derailleur that you have to keep charged, and then you have a battery in a seat post you have to keep charged, and then you have batteries in your shifters, which are little lithium-ion, little coin cell batteries, and those go dead after a while. So you have a bike that has 6 batteries on it, and you have to keep track of this entire ecosystem, and that's a kind of a disaster. I mean, that really speaks to like the need to just have a centralized, especially on an e-bike, one battery should be powering the whole damn thing, and you shouldn't have to have. There should just be connections. And Shimano's got some patents on this in the works, definitely with connecting their ecosystems, but still. You have Fox that makes suspension forks, and to date, Shimano doesn't really make their own, so they either have to partner with somebody else or they have to figure out how to make that ecosystem work together. But maybe they don't want to partner with SRAM, obviously, because they're a competitor. So then you have these, again, disparate systems that don't really play nice with each other. And so we're kind of like, we've got like, basically the bike industry is motor technology, drivetrain technology, suspension technology, and frame technology. And they're all interfacing, but doing it in ways that...
interacting.
They're not interacting, right.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it, yeah. I remember like 8 years ago at Eurobike, I saw Canyon partner with Deutsche Telekom, and they had this kind of their version of the bike of the future. And it, I can't even remember exactly everything it had on it, but it was just like I just sat there kind of like mouth open. I'm like, oh my God, because the guy explained it to me. It was like, if the bike falls over, it's going to send an alarm out. If it stays over too long, it means you've crashed. I mean, there was like just so many different things. The bike, it never went anywhere, unfortunately, or maybe tenets of it did. But in terms of the actual bike, but it was just interesting. This is, this is like pre-e-bike even. But it was just a system of technology with Deutsche Telekom about how they were using that kind of communication technology on a bicycle that would, give you, similar to what you're saying, all these different kinds of alerts, and it was working, interacting with then urban kind of technology as well, whether it was red light technology or stuff under the streets. So, what about just for the sake of it's so easy when we talk about technology and all this stuff to talk about full suspension bikes and e-bikes. What's left for in terms of future technologies for the person who just wants to ride a bicycle? I mean, like, is it just that sometimes again I get worried about almost defensive like for the bicycle because we do get carried away, and I think that sometimes there was a criticism in the industry where the bike industry itself was its own worst enemy because we're on this constant treadmill of new technology. Oh, we've and so each year last year's greatest suspension bike ever is outdated because they've now come up with something new. And so between the dealers who are sitting on inventory that's not going anywhere because all the kids want the latest, greatest, how much can do you see it? Is it the bike industry, to any degree, if accurate, that it's victimized by this kind of constant pursuit of technology and craziness in terms of always being up to date or being ahead of the other guy? Such to the degree that especially that the regular bicycle is just kind of like falling by the wayside?
I would say that one of the biggest problems to that is the fact that companies are putting products on the market too quickly.
Yeah.
Like I see like everything you see in catalogs, like we've been in the works for the last 3 years, that's usually bullshit. And they come to a company like Faction Bike Studio when it's already too late and say like, can you help us? Like we promised we were going to come out with this bike, but it's not working. Can you help us? So I wish companies would spend more time thinking about bikes, and bike would have a longer longevity in bike shop that would get rid of the obsolescence.
Yeah.
Another related problem is that all these different companies that are contributing to the bicycle, let's say you're talking about suspension, they have their own design cycle that do not necessarily match. So your bike may become obsolete just because of a front fork that has changed, and the rest of the bike is identical to the year previously. So that's the risk of not owning the whole bicycle system. So you're not controlling in the parts that you're buying from. These companies are usually bigger than the bike brand itself. Like SRAM is much bigger than their clients.
Yeah.
So they have the power of dictating the rate at which they introduce product and create the obsolescence.
Yeah, but I think the point that you're making though about just the average bike missing out, or that the consumer is being left behind in all this technological advancement, is actually, I think, one of the smartest things that's ever happened in the bike industry in the last 20 years came from Shimano just recently on their Qs program. They're basically their lower end components that they have, the 9, 10, and 11 speed. All the chains are the exact same. Even though they're different speeds, they still use the same chain pitch. They still use the same components. All of it is interchangeable. And it actually was one of the coolest things. Like, wow, Shimano, like, nice on you for like making a ecosystem of components that the average bike consumer can purchase and not have to worry so much about the availability of parts in the future, or like if you bought a 9-speed drivetrain from SRAM, 5, 6, 10 years ago, whatever it is, good luck finding a chain for that, right? Like you have to like go to Amazon or some behemoth company to find like replacement parts for that. But I think Shimano was really smart, and they stepped up to the plate and they designed this ecosystem that was like interchangeable and intercompatible with everything else in there. from like $500 bikes up to $1,500 bikes. It was really cool. But and I think some of that is the trickle down of all of this technology talk that we're talking about, and it does infiltrate into the the normal bike. And I think a lot of companies overlook that $1,500 $500 to $1,500 price point, but those bikes are amazing now. Those bikes work really well, and they work really well because of the technology and the $12,000 bikes that have been able to sort of push their way down, over the 5-year, 10-year period.
Yeah. So this has been a great discussion, and again, we're going to wrap it up, but I'm going to ask each of you a question. It's the same question I've been asking racers, designers for decades, and I just tries to get to the point of why we're all here. And honestly, I've asked Mr. Colnago the question, I've asked Dave Waynes the question, right? I mean, because all these different people, because again, we're all seem in rapture over this thing called the bicycle. So the question basically is as simply as, what is it? And you can, it's as broad as it needs to be or specific, but what is it about the bicycle for each of you?
For me, it's like the multiplication of human power to be one of the most efficient means of transportation ever. Like faster than walking, and it's just kind of like amazing. That's what brought me to the bicycle, and what keeps me fascinating with bikes.
Freedom, yeah, for sure. Freedom. Freedom is the reason that bikes are the most amazing piece of transportation on our planet. Like, we can go anywhere and do anything on a bicycle. And quite honestly, I think the bicycle could be the means to end every crisis that we have on this planet. We could end the Middle East peace conference with the bicycle, I swear to God. You just get Palestinians and Israelis to ride together and go on a mountain bike ride, or go down to their local shop together and geek out on bike parts. They would find out like, oh, you guys are the exact same people. Like the bike is both the means of freedom and the means of connection that can really bring every community together, and I think that's the most amazing thing.
Yeah, and that's so. I mean, that was didn't know where you were going to go, and I was just going to close it up by saying, because I mean, so many times I've asked hundreds of people that question, and the one that keeps coming up more frequently is freedom. People talk about it in terms of like when we're 9 years old and we get our first bicycle, and it's the first time we go to the next block or the next block on a bicycle. Because it just like and I always think back. It's kind of has a bad ending, but in that movie City of Angels, with Nicolas Cage, and there's this the actress's name, the one from Sleepless in Seattle, a little blonde, what's her name? Anyways, she's on a bicycle at the end of the movie. She's going to end up having a bad ending to it. But there's this moment where she's on this bicycle, and she's just fallen in love with, God forbid, and she's on this bicycle going back with the fresh breakfast. She's going to make him breakfast. But anyways, just this moment, and I've made this joke about it, but she's on this old cruiser bike going down Lake Tahoe, and all of a sudden, she's just so infused with the freedom of the moment of being on that bicycle. That's how I interpret it. She puts her arms out, and she's looking up at the trees and the heavens above, And to me, that's just always been like this fabulous. It's like that's the bicycle, right? Again, and then she gets hit by a car. So it's like we not that part, but that's part of it too. But that actually, for me, that's part of it too, because it's, I love, like, people say, how can you ride a road bike in LA? I'm like, God, the challenge is fantastic. It's like, it's always, something, but freedom. And so again, like, a wheelie contest in the Middle East or something would be maybe some way to kind of get some to new place of peace between communities.
I think the take back from that bit about the City of Angels is that you do, when you're on a bicycle, need to look where you're going. It's just, there you go, the easy takeaway.
Okay, so with all that, we're gonna, on that note, Sergio?
We can take some questions.
You got a mic coming in.
You guys have talked a lot about sources of innovation and challenges to bring it to the market, and it's pretty cool to see you kind of watching and waiting for trickle-down innovation, but then also acknowledging that some of that's still happening, with creative folks in their garages or whatever. And you're in this position to kind of see these different points of innovation in addition to what you come up with yourself. But from that moment, then there's the implementation, and then the delivery, to the market. And you've touched a little bit on, how compressed should that be? And so I was wondering if you could each comment kind of on that space between innovation and delivery, because that's got to have some real unique challenges.
I think the more you're innovating, the more you're innovating, the more you need to allow for proper evaluation. I think it's the further you're pushing the envelope, the more you need to like step back and ask, A, why, B, will anybody accept this? I mean, maybe the answer is no, I don't know, and no, and you still want to like figure it out and go for it and make something unique. I mean, the small people do have the ability to sort of just make it and see what happens. Many of the frame builders at Made, they don't go through ISO fatigue testing on their frames. They don't really even know what that is. They just build them, they weld them in their garage, and they like go and ride them. And if they break them, then they figure out a better way to do it. And so, it really just kind of depends on how you want to bring that innovation to market. Rick, I think, is going to probably talk about this a little bit later too in the COI event. But innovation also comes with either the desire to bring a new bike brand to market, or the desire to sell the technology or to license it or to do something else, and those are two wildly different paths. And right now, the bike industry is really oversaturated with a lot of people trying to sort of all take a piece of the very small pie. And the industry has done a terrible job trying to grow the pie. We're all just fighting for scraps from the same pie. And that pie is a finite size. And I think that's one of the problems the bike industry is facing right now, is that they've not actively gone to increase the pie size in a way that's meaningful to other people. And the COVID-19 obviously changed the industry forever, but what it did was it created this demand that was just there was an insatiable appetite for bikes, because people were just stuck in their homes or stuck, without the ability to do things that they would normally do. And they were like, the bike, I got to get a bike. And everybody freaked out and went and bought a bike. And the bike industry was like, yay, we have a bigger pie. And then they realized within 6 months that pie was completely and utterly eaten and gone. And now the pie is back to the size it was before, or even smaller. And so innovation, I think, a lot of times is either stifled by or stuck by where the industry as a whole is at any given moment. And I think innovation is happening all the time, but whether it gets to people or whether people see it or whether people have any contact with it is a different story. And I think the cool thing about social media and where we are today in media and journalism is that there is a bigger outlet for those smaller players to show their products and have people see them even on a micro scale. But it also means it's harder to get it to market, I think.
And there is a great opportunity with what we call micro-mobility as a way of getting around, not using your car, basically. So electric cars do not solve traffic issues. You're just replacing like a gas problem with an electric problem of the same size. Bicycle can really kind of change the way we do transportation, and suddenly there's a shift. So if you say like that a cargo bike or a long tail can be a mean of transportation for a small family, then even if it costs like $10,000, $15,000, it's not like considered expensive if it's replacing a second family car. So it's actually less expensive, takes less footprint, and it has a real change on how our cities will be developed in the future, and Europe is making that shift. And that's why all the automotive companies are so interested in bicycles. It's not because of the performance aspect of it. It's because of what it can become for micro-mobility. And they know that their car business is going down, so this is their way out. And I wish that it's the bicycle brand that will take these opportunities and not the automotive players. Because sometimes I think they over-engineer the product. Like bikes needs to stay simple and...
Yeah, I mean, that's another case where in America especially, policy is driving that demand or not. So it really depends on the city that you're in. Bentonville is an amazing example of a city that's put in an infrastructure that can sustain and take the growth of the micromobility market and turn it into a way of a community to get from point A to point B safely and efficiently. And we're just barely scratching the surface of this in America, and policies really need to be activated to sort of drive a lot more of that. Where, in Europe, as Erick said, spending $10,000 on a commuter bike is not a big deal because it literally is your vehicle, and it is the way that you get to city center, and it is the way that you go grocery shopping, and it is the way that you pick up your kids from school. And in America, only a fraction of the cities have even touched on this idea in any meaningful way. Portland has done a really great job, and Bentonville I've only been here 2 days, and I'm like pretty astounded with the infrastructure that they put in here. So it's pretty cool to see.
And overall, that is the shame of the bike industry, I think, is that we push so, we get so jaded and starry-eyed about the performance and the racing and the high-end stuff, and we forget about the vital importance that bicycles can play on a much more lower level of, have nothing to do with carbon fiber, but just replacing cars and being the family, being a family element in terms of what a bicycle can do in a community. I think like we have People for Bikes. I saw People for Bikes tent here, and luckily that they're driving the message about spreading bikes and bike technology and bike mentality. But it's just interesting. There's, as much as we're talking about all this kind of this crazy stuff, bikes with no chains, that the bicycle fundamentally is still, can be this simple creature that can provide so much vitality and importance to anyone's individual life or family life. And I think that in terms of the bike industry itself, it'd be great if we spent still a little bit more time focusing on that side of the market as well, of just all the high-end stuff. Next one.
Yeah, so you were touching a little bit about the Canyon Future Bike and also talking about the automobile industry kind of coming into the space. Is there patents and technology starting to come into place where we're going to be able to get a diagnostic of the entire bike with all the batteries, the tires, the shocks, things along those lines, whether on our app or on a watch? And are you seeing that coming in the future?
Yeah, it already started, especially with brands that own the old distribution, that owns the retail space as well. They want to have a mean of understanding what needs to be done on the bike. For instance, ZEG Group in Germany is a big conglomerate of dealers and bike brands. They have a company under that umbrella that is called FIT, and they are bringing connectivity between all the different components, so everything that can be instrumented as a sensor in it. And it's all connected into like a cloud system, so from the get-go which part your bike had. When you're coming in the bike shop, like the technician will hook up the bike and basically have a full-on diagnosis of the bicycle and be able to influence for them, like when we see it from a business standpoint, it's a way to generate awareness and maintenance, like the car industry did with after a certain amount of miles, like this is time to change your tires, brake pads, things like that. So
yeah,
it's coming.
That was part of the Canyon thing, and I've heard it from Trek guys too, telling me like their vision of the future. This is a couple years ago, but it's just like Erick saying, you go to a Trek dealer, it's like going to a Ford dealer, and it's like they have their service center, and they got excuse me, all the prices, it's all, everything is just uniformity, which brought a small tear to my eye. But it's there for the sake of I guess the more efficient for the consumer. I guess it's good and bad, I guess, but it was exactly that. And the Canyon thing was the same thing. It would tell you, it give you these alarms. The Deutsche Telekom bike, that you have 8,000 miles on your chain. This needs to be, everything. That was the whole thing, was in terms of just passing that kind of information through an integrated system to the consumer, so that just look at your phone and it's just telling you exactly what to do. So it was a mind-blowing moment. This is like 7 or 8 years ago, a Eurobike that he's telling me that, because I couldn't even conceive. I was still grappling with having a cell phone right, Tony? And so it was just like crazy that all that kind of information could be, generated through your bicycle and into your life that way without even having to think about it.
I feel like SRAM is probably the closest. They have the most parts that talk to each other currently. I mean, they have bought their computer. They bought the company that makes computers. Can't remember what is that company? Karuko, whatever. Karu, is that who they bought? Yeah. So anyway, they own the computer now. They have like those Tire Whiz, which are wireless, sensors that tell you what your tire pressure is. They have the Shock Whiz. They have all this. They're starting to combine their whole ecosystem into a single one point of communication function. But I still think the disparate battery / motor companies being separate from that is sort of the missing piece of the puzzle that we need to sort of like close the loop on. So it'll get there for sure.
And I think for SRAM, they got into the electronic space like part almost by mistake, because their initial design for the SRAM E-Tap, where you were shifting the front derailleur by holding the two buttons at the same time. So they wanted to use Bluetooth N+, but none of these protocol was providing a mean of having two inputs to get a simple output. So they end up writing their own code for talking between the ecosystem. And that got them into the electronic and programming and so on. And this year and today, I think they have an edge. And it's basically what I'm saying, like bike companies needs to get into that part of the design and not solely rely on outsourced vendor with blinders on. They need to get involved in understanding the possibilities for the future.